Another actor in this, and we've talked a lot about corn in the context of ethanol, but there's also cellulosic ethanol. And that's playing an interesting role, or not playing an interesting role in the overall debate and what's happening as we look at ways to try and address some of our fuel issues, but at the same time not undermine the food market in the way that we've been discussing. And I was just wondering if one of you could talk about the role that cellulosic is playing in the RFS debate or conversation.
I mean, I really can't talk about that directly, but I can say that one thing, farmers want to make money. And so if there is this opportunity to switch out of food into fuel production, I don't really see how you could stop farmers from doing that. And that's only very tangential to what you said. Mm-hmm. And I can't speak to the other aspect of.
So my very short answer is non-corn alternatives will not be taken seriously until the Iowa caucus becomes the 20th contest instead of the first.
So the raw politics of it.
There are raw politics of it. If you got people to have truth serum to tell you, in their free time what they really believed of this, you'd see a lot less support for these policies than how people are voting and speaking.
Right, because this also isn't a partisan issue. This is in many ways a regional battle and debate that takes place, and I think that speaks to your comments about Iowa, and you could talk about other Midwestern, corn-producing states in that way.
So if I could just say one thing on that topic, we seem to have converged in this country anyway to using corn as our form of biofuel, but it doesn't have to be corn. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are plenty of other agricultural products that will work in that capacity. So I think that, again, maybe ties to the political will.
I've heard you can make energy by burning the New York Post.
It looks like you wanted to say something.
I just think that one of the interesting factors here is that this country in particular is becoming an energy exporter, which wasn't the case some decades ago. To a certain degree, the use of non-fossil fuel additives may not be as important as it was once in the past. The other thing is, if we're not seeing an environmental benefit to doing so, then you might as well just relieve this issue, so to speak, by eliminating the mix of food fuel and fossil fuel altogether. Before you wanted some real life examples, but somebody whose job it is to haul or drive a truck, they will be compensated, and then when you subtract out fuel, that's how they're going to get their net. So they're going to get paid on a gross, and they're going to net out after they've gotten from A to B. If it costs them more to do so, they're going to get paid less. So that's another effect within the supply chain that people don't think about, and it's something that was mentioned before, is that you have to remember that there are multiple components to the final food product's cost. It could be liability insurance, way off topic, but I'm just putting out that there are a lot of variables. The production, if it uses any fuel, fossil or blend of fossil and food fuel, will change. So basically you have to run a plant, you have to run a facility that's going to do whatever it's going to do, whether it's processing protein or whether it's milling grains or changing the nature of corn, whether it's going to be feed or high fructose corn syrup, et cetera. You have to run a facility. So when the price goes up, when the price of fuel goes up, whether it's fossil fuel in its raw form or for the transition into electricity, that's going to affect the final product. The raw good, yes, it will cost more to feed a pig if pig feed goes up, which is grain or corn based. That's one component. But there's a slew of components, and a lot of them are actually related to the fuel scenario. So that has a big implication within the supply chain in general, both the trucker, hauler, the processing facility, the farm itself. I mean, let's face it, you need large agricultural equipment to either plow your field or harvest your field. That's going to affect the farmer producer. So one way or another, you have your variables in there. They are variables, and some can go up and down simultaneously. They can all go up or all go down. and that's what affects the final consumer price. So sometimes when we do see commodities spike, the agricultural commodities, livestock or grains, you may not see the price of fossil fuels going up, whether it's natural gas or petroleum based. And that's one of the things that I think is the disconnect with the consumer, and it could be the consumer at the grocery level or at the food service restaurant level, is you read or see the news, but you don't understand how all the pieces interrelate, and then all of a sudden you're trying to figure out if you're getting, in quotes, ripped off, or if you're getting a value, but you have no way of really truly assessing what that formula is.
Well, and I want to pick up on that 'cause in about 5 or 6 minutes, want to turn to the audience and just kind of tick through some of those impacts and get you all's reaction to them. And I think, Carolyn, you were saying one of the things you wanted people to walk away with are to have a sense of some of the unintended consequences as we try and make policy, and then there's a ripple effect, things we never thought about. And I will say this as a former Senate staff person, House staff person, when you're sitting there writing the legislation, and a year or two later you find out, here's some of the things that were a consequence that you hadn't thought about before.
Sure.
So in doing that, one category of things would be the environment, for example, and thinking about land use, water quality, soil fertility and erosion, fresh water supply. I was wondering if you all had a reaction to, or could illuminate for us, what some of the impact has been of RFS, of the Renewable Fuel Standard, when we look at the environment. Sasanka?
Sure. That's a really good question. We're really actively engaged right now and a lot of us in the debate of just energy choices and fossils versus renewables. And there's a bill actually passing through the House today on Electrify Africa, and we're sort of really engaged on trying to articulate what is actually the best type of energy choice when the poorest people are impacted. And I feel like this debate is very synonymous to it, because what drives me insane is that this was sort of pitched as a saving model for our energy security and the climate crisis. But all of these, what we call the negative externalities, and when we try to say fight coal or fracking, we want to try and quantify these other environmental and social impacts on water, on local health pollutions, and actually show that is far more economically costly. And I think the same very much applies here. There's a range of evidence to sort of show the impacts, say, simply just on the fertilizer use and what the nitrates can do to drinking water. There's a range of evidence to show the impacts on soil erosion and land use changes. And the thing that is really sort of perplexing and mind-boggling is that it's the biggest fallacy of this entire thing in how it was pitched was the greenhouse gas potential that the ethanol mandate has. For starters, it doesn't. There's an exemption for the types of emissions in terms of primary fuel use, in terms of coal and natural gas for ethanol production itself. So when you factor in the entire life cycle assessment in terms of production, transportation, and storage, no, you're not going to get a net greenhouse gas benefit. It doesn't factor in changes in terms of soil carbon which get released. This was pitched, particularly as Joel said, in the Iowa caucuses back in 2008, is the great saver to our climate solution. But we're ignoring all of these negative externalities, which really do need to be factored in.
Does anyone else want to comment on?
And I guess just to follow up on what you're saying, I mean, that is the problem inherent in how we produce food in general. We are just totally not cognizant of the impact of any kind of agricultural production on the environment. And I mean, so in that sense, I find it difficult to support most agricultural policy and most energy policy, because it really, over the long term, we're not really promoting future food production or environmental sustainability. And I think that, in the long run, that is a really poor strategy.
And one more category I want to talk about, particularly, I know this is in several of your wheelhouses, but thinking about the economic impacts. Joel, you touched on a little bit, Dan, you were talking about food supply chains, talking about restaurants, talking about producers, and what the economic shocks are for them. Also looking at agricultural markets, and not only domestically, but also, Sasanka, thinking about this globally as well. We've touched on that a little bit, but also thinking about commodity crops and livestock feed. And I was wondering if you all wanted to kind of crystallize what you think some of the specific RFS economic impacts are when we look at those different categories.
I guess I'll start off there. I mean, I think I'm probably the least prepared to talk about overall policy, but from a global perspective, or even just a domestic one, what we're seeing is scarcity and volatility, as we mentioned before, and so what we've in essence done is we've interconnected two fields that didn't have a basis to be together to begin with. The impact that I'm seeing is throughout the chain is more of a the way I look at it is kind of like the social. It's more like social, not socialist, but like how it's all interconnected from the top to the bottom and back up. And I don't know. I'm not really succinctly getting my point across here. I'm kind of like at a loss for the words that I need to get the point. So I'll pass it over to one of my panelist members and kind of come back to me.
Maybe just go down the line. So I guess one thing is the markets actually have been connected for a long time, but prior it was more like a residual market. Like we have corn and we don't know what to do with it. We can't sell it in the food market, so let's like bring it to the fuel market. But I think my main objection is these types of standards just promote more of the types of agriculture that are not really sustainable in the long run. And so anything that keeps us on that path, especially if you couch it in terms of it's going to reduce these social problems and environmental problems we're having, it's just exacerbating, I think it may be heightening the already existing tensions in the food system.
And Carolyn, do you find, you were talking about sustainability in that context, that in the policy community, are people starting to wake up to or having the conversation about the long-term, the sustainability issues, the viability and what the long-term effects are of the policy, or kind of coming back to or drawing in the political piece of this? Is there such calcification that we're unable to see movement?
Well, I mean, I think that the people that think seriously about agriculture and the environment, at least in the U.S., they are not really on the cutting edge of policy. They're there are definitely groups that are lobbying and trying to have policy changes implemented, but I think we're still looking at maybe what the National Research Council calls these incremental changes rather than these transformative changes. So I think that the current operating practice I don't really see much movement in the policy world in shifting how things are done, except maybe tweaks at the margin.
If I can just differentiate between policy thinking and policy making.
Mm-hmm.
For a young guy, I've been doing this sort of work in some way, shape, or form for a few decades, and I've never seen a bigger disconnect between what experts think is the right answer and what Washington is doing. And these policies are exhibit A for how our entire political system is fundamentally broken. Corporate agribusinesses have donated over $600 million to federal campaigns over the last decade. I've contributed less. And if you talk about lack of ideological consistency about commodity or location trumping ideology, you've heard some people say that the government helping marshal private citizens to buy private health care is somehow socialism. Preposterous. These programs, however, are 1,000 times more socialist than the Affordable Care Act ever could be. Farm subsidies, they're socialist. Government intervention into the private marketplace, telling private companies what they can produce at what levels, that's socialist. And yet you see many of the most right-wing, self-identifying Tea Party's members of the House and Senate voting happily for this, because it has nothing to do with ideology. It has to do with power and money.
And Sasanka, do you want to comment on this as well? Just 1 second. After Sasanka comments, I want to take questions from the audience. So this is your moment to gather your thoughts and be ready to jump in so we can spend about the last 15 minutes or so engaging with one another. Sasanka.
Sure. No, I mean, I guess it was just to answer your initial question about sort of economic impacts.
Please.
And just to reiterate, sort of, I think I used a lot of my ammunition in the opening salvo, but that there are very directly attributable, measurable macroeconomic impacts on the developing world. I mean, I state the 6.6 billion figure again in net importing corn countries. There are impacts, the Guatemala example, there are impacts in Mexico, in the Sahel, I mean, the region that's been ravaged by security and terrible drought and famine is incredibly susceptible to multiple shocks. I think something like 30 to 60% more so than other countries. So particularly in these sort of fragile and conflict-affected states where people are really fighting for very basic provisions of services, let alone sort of rights, basic human rights, these impacts do actually make a significant, the effects of these mandates do have a significant impact.
Thank you.